I thought I knew what petty looked like before I moved to Willowbrook Estates. I really did. But nothing could have prepared me for Karen Hendricks, the self-appointed guardian of suburban perfection and president of our HOA for the past 8 consecutive years. The woman had turned neighborhood management into a full-time obsession, and I was about to become her latest project. It started innocently enough. I had purchased the corner lot property at the end of Maple Drive, a beautiful 2-acre parcel with mature oak trees and a gentle slope that offered privacy from the main road. The house itself was a charming craftsman-style home that needed some updating, but the bones were solid. More importantly, the property had something increasingly rare in our area: space. Real space. The kind where you couldn't hear your neighbor's television through the walls, or smell what they were grilling for dinner. The first time I met Karen was during my second week in the neighborhood. I was outside measuring the fence line along my back property when I heard the distinctive click-clack of heels on my driveway. I turned to see a woman in her mid-50s approaching with a clipboard, her blonde hair sprayed into submission, wearing what I can only describe as business casual aggressive attire. A pressed blazer, pencil skirt, and an expression that suggested she had caught me committing a felony. "Hello there. I'm Karen Hendricks, HOA president. I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though I did approve your residency application." She extended her hand limply, as if the gesture was more obligation than greeting. "Before you go any further with this story, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to Karen World. Trust me, you are going to want to follow along for what happens next, because this situation goes from annoying to absolutely nuclear, and you won't believe how it ends. Seriously, subscribe so you don't miss the insane stories we post every single week. Now, back to Karen and her clipboard of doom. I shook her hand and introduced myself, trying to be neighborly despite the weird energy she was radiating. I was just checking my property boundaries, planning to do some landscaping in the spring. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, well, about that. I wanted to discuss the HOA guidelines with you. All exterior modifications require board approval. That includes landscaping, fencing, paint colors, and any structures. We maintain very high standards here at Willowbrook Estates." I assured her I would review the guidelines carefully. I had actually already read through them when I purchased the property. They were thorough but reasonable. Nothing too unusual for a modern suburban HOA. Standard stuff about lawn maintenance, no recreational vehicles visible from the street, that sort of thing. "Also," Karen continued, consulting her clipboard, "I noticed you've been parking your vehicle in your driveway rather than your garage. The guidelines state that garages should be utilized for vehicle storage to maintain the aesthetic appeal of the neighborhood." I glanced back at my truck sitting in my own driveway. I've been unloading renovation supplies. "The garage is currently full of materials." "I understand," she said in a tone that suggested she absolutely did not understand. "But the rules apply to everyone equally. I'll need you to remedy this by end of day tomorrow." With that, she turned on her heel and click-clacked back down my driveway, leaving me standing there wondering what I had gotten myself into. That was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, Karen found reasons to visit my property or send me violation notices on a weekly basis. My grass was 1/2 inch taller than the permitted height. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Apparently there was an approved list of paint colors, and mine was too blue-black instead of true black. I had placed my trash bins out 12 hours before the permitted time on collection day. Each violation came with a formal letter, a deadline, and an implied threat of fines. I complied with everything, despite the absurdity. I was busy with my actual job, consulting for tech companies on data security architecture, which I could do remotely from my home office. The last thing I needed was a protracted war with the neighborhood HOA. So I kept my head down, followed the rules and tried to stay off Karen's radar. Then came the property line dispute. I had hired a surveyor to mark the exact boundaries of my lot because I wanted to install a fence along the back section of my property. The woods behind my house were technically part of a greenbelt conservation area, and I wanted to create a clear boundary for wildlife and privacy. The surveyor came out, did his work, and placed bright orange stakes along the actual property line. That's when I discovered something interesting. My property extended about 15 feet further than I had thought. The previous owner had apparently never bothered to fence it properly, and over the years, the natural tree line had created an assumed boundary that was actually well inside my legal property line. This extra strip of land ran along the entire back section of my lot, approximately 150 feet long and 15 feet wide. Now, here's where it gets interesting. That strip of land happened to back up directly to Karen's property, and Karen had been using that section for years. She had a small shed positioned on it, about 5 feet onto my side of the actual property line. She also had a decorative stone pathway that wound through that area, connecting to what she called her meditation garden. Essentially, Karen had been trespassing on and improving my property without realizing it. When the surveyor's report came back confirming the boundary, I sat with it for a few days, thinking about how to handle the situation. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. My first instinct was to simply let it go. The shed and pathway weren't bothering me, and I had plenty of land. Why create a problem where none existed? But then I got another violation notice from Karen. This one claimed that my exterior light fixtures were not in compliance with the approved style guidelines and needed to be replaced within 30 days at my expense. The lights in question were original to the house, installed in 1985, decades before these particular guidelines existed. I had been grandfathered in, which I confirmed by actually reading the fine print of the HOA rules. When I politely pointed this out to Karen via email, providing the specific section and clause that exempted pre-existing fixtures, her response was chilling. The board will be reviewing your exemption claim at our next meeting. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you begin compliance measures. Willowbrook Estates has no room for residents who can't follow simple guidelines. That's when I decided to mention the property line issue. I sent her a polite, professional email explaining that the recent survey had revealed the actual boundaries and that her shed and pathway were positioned on my property. I suggested we meet to discuss a solution. Perhaps I could grant her an easement or we could adjust the positioning of her structures. I kept it friendly and solution-oriented. Her response arrived within an hour. That survey must be incorrect. My property boundaries have been established for 20 years. I will not be removing anything, and I suggest you hire a competent surveyor if you're confused about property lines. Furthermore, this kind of harassment of an HOA board member could result in additional scrutiny of your property for violations. I read that email 3 times. The audacity was breathtaking. She was squatting on my land and threatening me for pointing it out. I forwarded her email to my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia, who I had worked with on various contract negotiations over the years. Patricia's response was equally swift. "Oh, this is going to be fun. Want me to send her a formal notice?" I told Patricia to hold off for one more attempt at reasonableness. I tried calling Karen directly. She didn't answer, but she did send a text message. All HOA business must be conducted in writing through proper channels. Stop harassing me, or I will file a formal complaint. Fine. Proper channels it was. I had the surveyor create a formal boundary map, hired Patricia to draft a polite but firm letter explaining the encroachment, and sent everything via certified mail. The letter gave Karen 30 days to remove her structures from my property or negotiate an easement agreement. It was perfectly reasonable and professional. Karen's response was to call an emergency HOA board meeting and placed me on the agenda under new business. The meeting notice arrived 3 days later, informing me that the board would be discussing concerns regarding property disputes and member conduct, and that my presence was mandatory. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse. I showed up 15 minutes early with a folder containing the survey, the property deed, the correspondence history, and Patricia on speed dial. The clubhouse was a modest building near the neighborhood entrance, with a meeting room that held about 30 people. Karen was already there, sitting at a head table with 2 other board members I hadn't met. About a dozen other residents were scattered in the audience chairs, clearly there for the entertainment value. Karen called the meeting to order with great ceremony, working through routine business at a glacial pace. Lawn of the Month awards, upcoming holiday decoration guidelines, a reminder about the summer block party. Finally, after 45 minutes, she got to my item on the agenda. "Now we come to a concerning matter," Karen announced, her voice dripping with artificial gravity. "We have a resident who is attempting to claim that the property boundaries in our well-established neighborhood are somehow incorrect. This resident has been harassing me personally with threats of legal action over land that has been part of my property for 2 decades. This kind of behavior threatens the harmony and stability of our entire community." I sat there, genuinely amazed at the spin she was putting on the situation. She made it sound like I was trying to steal her land rather than simply asserting my legal property rights. "Would you like to address the board?" Karen asked me, her tone suggesting I absolutely should not. I stood and calmly explained the situation. I presented the survey results, showed the property deed, and explained that I had repeatedly tried to resolve this amicably. I even offered again, in front of the entire board, to discuss an easement agreement. Several residents in the audience were nodding along, seeming to recognize the reasonableness of my position. Karen's face was turning an interesting shade of red. "This survey is clearly wrong. I know where my property ends. I've lived here for 23 years. One of the other board members, an older gentleman named Howard, spoke up. "Karen, if he has a certified survey, that's pretty definitive. Maybe we should have the HOA survey the line independently to verify?" "That won't be necessary," Karen snapped. "I know my property. This is clearly a manufactured crisis designed to harass me. I motion that we formally censure this resident for creating unnecessary conflict and threatening legal action against a board member." That's when I knew Karen wasn't operating in reality anymore. She had built her entire identity around control and authority in this neighborhood, and she couldn't accept that she might be wrong. The other board members looked uncomfortable but ultimately abstained from her motion, effectively killing it. The meeting ended with no resolution, but the dynamic was clear. Karen was going to fight this to the bitter end. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated in ways I couldn't have predicted. Karen filed a counter-survey request with a company I later discovered was run by her brother-in-law. Shockingly, his survey claimed the original boundary was correct and my surveyor was wrong. When I had my surveyor review his work, they found multiple errors and non-standard methodology. It was a hack job, clearly designed to support Karen's position. Then came the violation notices. Suddenly, Karen was finding problems with my property every single day. My house number wasn't properly illuminated. My sprinkler system created runoff onto the sidewalk. My chimney needed tuck pointing for aesthetic reasons. One notice claimed that my roof shingles were not the approved color, despite being the original roof that predated the guidelines by 15 years. Each notice came with escalating fine schedules. $50 for the first week of non-compliance, $100 for the second week, $200 for the third. She was clearly trying to financially pressure me into backing down on the property dispute. I documented everything and forwarded it all to Patricia. Her response was succinct. "She's building your case for you." Keep records of everything. Don't respond to her provocations. When she's dug the hole deep enough, we'll proceed." But Karen wasn't done. She started showing up at my property unannounced, taking photographs of alleged violations. I caught her on my security cameras walking around my house, peering in windows, measuring distances with a tape measure. When I asked her via email to stop trespassing, she responded that as HOA president, she had the right to inspect properties for compliance. That wasn't true, according to the HOA bylaws. But Karen had apparently decided that rules were for other people. I installed additional cameras and kept recording. The footage was increasingly bizarre. Karen measuring the exact height of my grass with a ruler. Karen counting the number of decorative rocks in my landscaping. Karen photographing my car's license plate for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. Then she made her biggest mistake. She filed a lien against my property with the county for unpaid HOA fines. The total was over $3,000, representing all the bogus violations she had been issuing. A property lien is serious business. It goes on your title and has to be resolved before you can sell or refinance. It was a direct attack on my property rights. I called Patricia. She just went nuclear. "Time for us to respond?" "Oh yes," Patricia said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Let's go to work." What Karen didn't know was that I wasn't just a tech consultant. I had done very well in the industry, well enough that I had options most people don't have. I had sold a data security firm to a major corporation 3 years earlier for an amount I don't usually discuss. The consulting work I did now was more about staying engaged with the field than financial necessity. I lived modestly by choice, not requirement. I also had connections. One of my former business partners was now a real estate developer with projects throughout the region. Another was a civil engineer who specialized in land use and zoning. I had attorneys on retainer for various business interests. When you have resources, and you've been patient for months while someone harasses you, you start to think creatively about solutions. Patricia and I started with the legal basics. We filed a formal lawsuit for adverse possession prevention and property encroachment. We demanded Karen remove her structures from my land within 15 days or face daily fines. We also filed a countersuit against the HOA for harassment, targeting Karen specifically for her abuse of her position. The lien she had filed was included as evidence of retaliatory behavior. But that was just the opening move. While Patricia worked the legal angles, I started researching something that had caught my attention during my original property purchase. The conservation greenbelt behind our properties wasn't owned by the county or the HOA as I had assumed. It was actually owned by a private land trust that had been established by the original developers of Willowbrook Estates in the 1970s. The land trust was essentially dormant. It existed on paper, with a small board of trustees who met once a year to confirm nothing had changed. The greenbelt couldn't be developed due to environmental protections and deed restrictions. It was just sitting there, a 50-acre buffer of woods and wetlands behind about 30 properties in the neighborhood. I made some calls. It turned out the land trust was open to offers. The board was aging out. Nobody wanted to maintain it anymore, and they were happy to entertain a purchase offer from someone who would maintain the conservation restrictions. The price was shockingly reasonable, essentially just enough to cover their legal costs to dissolve the trust and transfer the deed. Within 3 weeks, I owned the greenbelt, all 50 acres of it, including the section directly behind Karen's property. Now, here's where the property lines got really interesting. When I had the entire area surveyed properly, including my new greenbelt purchase, we discovered something fascinating. There was an old access easement from the 1970s that allowed the land trust to access the greenbelt for maintenance. That easement ran across several properties, including Karen's. The easement had never been used because the trust had been inactive for decades. But it was still legally valid. And now I owned the land that the easement provided access to, which meant I had legal right of access across those properties, including Karen's backyard, to reach my land. I also discovered that Karen's property had another issue. Her septic system, which serviced her house, had a drainage field that extended onto the greenbelt. Not my original property, but the greenbelt I now owned. About 30 feet of perforated pipe and drainage area were technically on my land. According to county records, this had been grandfathered in decades ago when the regulations were different, but that grandfathering was specifically tied to the land trust's ownership and their informal permission. Now that I owned the land, that informal arrangement was null and void. Karen's septic system was technically trespassing on my property, just like her shed and pathway had been on my other parcel. Patricia almost fell out of her chair laughing when I explained what I had found. You bought 50 acres to solve a fence dispute? That's the most extra thing I've ever seen. Wait until you hear the rest, I told her. I explained my plan. She stopped laughing and started taking notes. This is diabolical. I love it. Let me make sure we're bulletproof legally. Over the next week, Patricia worked with my real estate attorney and a land use specialist to structure everything perfectly. We confirmed every easement, every property right, every legal detail. When we were absolutely certain everything was legitimate and enforceable, we sent Karen a new set of letters. The first letter informed her that her shed and pathway on my original property needed to be removed within 7 days, as she had failed to comply with previous notices. The second letter informed her that her septic system was encroaching on my greenbelt property and would need to be relocated at her expense within 90 days per county environmental regulations. The third letter informed her that I would be exercising my easement rights to access the greenbelt for property maintenance, which would require regular access across her backyard. But the fourth letter was the masterpiece. It informed Karen that I was filing for a zoning change on a 2-acre section of the greenbelt directly behind her property. The conservation restrictions allowed for limited educational and recreational use. I was proposing to establish a nature education center with associated parking facilities, walking trails, and outdoor classroom spaces. The parking area would be positioned to use the access easement, meaning vehicles would be driving through Karen's backyard regularly. The walking trails would bring families and school groups within feet of her property line. The outdoor classroom would be positioned exactly where her meditation garden currently sat, just on my side of the boundary. All of it was perfectly legal. The conservation restrictions specifically allowed educational use. The access easement gave me the right to cross her property. The parking and facilities met all setback requirements from her house. I had letters of support from 3 local schools and an environmental nonprofit. The County Planning Commission loved the idea of free nature education for the community. Karen received all 4 letters on the same day via certified mail. I wasn't there to see her reaction, but I heard about it from multiple sources. According to her next-door neighbor, she could be heard screaming inside her house loud enough to be heard from the street. She called an emergency HOA board meeting the next day. This time, I attended with Patricia. Karen was practically vibrating with rage, her carefully sprayed hair looking slightly disheveled, her clipboard clutched in white-knuckled hands. "This is extortion," she shrieked as soon as she saw me. "You can't do this. You're trying to destroy my property value. You're harassing me." Patricia calmly handed the board copies of all our documentation. The surveys, the property deeds, the easement records, the zoning application. Everything official, everything legal, everything beautifully, perfectly legitimate. "My client has been extraordinarily patient," Patricia said in her courtroom voice. "He has made multiple attempts to resolve these issues amicably. He has endured months of harassment, bogus violations, and an illegal lien. He has now simply chosen to exercise his legal property rights. If Mrs. Hendricks had been willing to discuss reasonable solutions months ago, none of this would be necessary. Howard, the other board member, was reading through the documents with increasing comprehension. Karen, he owns the Greenbelt now. And there's an easement across your property? Did you know about this? Karen's face was cycling through shades of red and purple. He can't build a parking lot behind my house. He can't. It's not behind your house, I said calmly. It's on my property, which I can develop within the allowed parameters. The access happens to cross your property because that's where the legal easement is. And your septic system happens to be on my property, which we'll need to address. This is because of that shed, Karen said, her voice dropping to something dangerous. You're doing all of this because of property lines? You're insane. I'll sue you. I'll fight this. You're welcome to try, Patricia said pleasantly. But I should mention that continuing to harass my client or filing frivolous legal actions at this point will be added to our existing lawsuit. We're already seeking damages for your abuse of your HOA position. I wouldn't recommend making it worse. The meeting devolved from there. Karen refused to accept reality, insisting that her brother-in-law's survey was correct, that the easement wasn't valid, that I couldn't possibly own the Greenbelt. The other board members were clearly uncomfortable, starting to realize that their president had created a catastrophic situation through her stubbornness and pettiness. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen tried everything. She filed complaints with the county claiming my zoning application was fraudulent. They investigated and approved it anyway. She tried to get the HOA to file an injunction against me. The board refused and actually removed her as president in an emergency vote, replacing her with Howard. She hired an attorney who sent threatening letters until Patricia responded with our documented evidence of Karen's months of harassment. Karen's husband apparently tried to talk sense into her, suggesting they just negotiate a settlement. She refused. She had convinced herself this was about principle, about standing up to a bully, about protecting the neighborhood. She couldn't see that she had been the bully all along, and that she had picked a fight with someone who had the resources and patience to comprehensively outmaneuver her. The septic system issue was the real pressure point. County Environmental Services confirmed that her system was encroaching on my property and that she would need to relocate it. The cost would be somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000. She tried to argue that it had been there for decades, but without the land trust's informal permission, she had no legal leg to stand on. She came to my door exactly once during all of this. It was a Saturday morning, and I was working in my garden when I heard my doorbell ring insistently, over and over. I walked around to the front to find Karen standing on my porch, looking like she hadn't slept in days. "We need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. "This has gone too far. You need to stop this vendetta and be reasonable." I took a breath, trying one last time to find common ground. "Karen, I tried to be reasonable. 6 months ago, when I found the property line issue, I offered to work with you. You threatened me instead. Every step of the way, I've tried to resolve this, and you've escalated. This isn't a vendetta. This is me protecting my property rights after months of your harassment. I'm the victim here," she shouted. "You're trying to ruin my life over a stupid shed." "No," I said quietly. "You ruined this yourself. You couldn't stand the idea that you might be wrong. You used your HOA position as a weapon. You filed a fraudulent lien against my property. You left me no choice but to respond in kind." "I'll drop everything," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "The lien, the violations, all of it. Just stop with the septic system and the parking lot. Please." I considered it for about 10 seconds. But then I remembered the months of harassment, the constant violation notices, the way she had tried to intimidate me at every turn. Some people never learn unless they face real consequences. The septic system is a county issue now, not between you and me. You're encroaching on my property, and environmental services requires you to fix it. As for the nature center, that project has county approval and community support. Construction starts in 2 months. I'm sorry, Karen, but you made this bed. She stared at me like I had slapped her. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back to her house. I watched her go, feeling something between sympathy and satisfaction. I hadn't wanted any of this, but I wasn't going to apologize for standing my ground. The timeline moved forward like clockwork. The county gave Karen a formal deadline to remove her septic encroachment. The nature center plans were approved. My attorney continued pressing the harassment lawsuit, compiling every violation notice, every threatening email, every instance of Karen abusing her HOA authority. Then came the breaking point. Karen received the official notice that her septic system work needed to begin within 30 days, or the county would condemn the system and red tag her house as uninhabitable. The cost estimates came in at $65,000 for a full system relocation and installation. She also received the construction timeline for the nature center. Work would begin in 6 weeks. The parking area, which would accommodate 15 vehicles plus a bus turnaround, would be positioned exactly where her meditation garden currently sat, with just the property line between them. The access easement across her backyard would be improved with gravel and drainage for regular vehicle use. I was in my home office when I saw her through my window. Karen walked out of her house and stood in her backyard, just stood there, looking at the stakes I had placed marking where the parking lot would be. She was holding what looked like the county notice in one hand and the construction plans in the other. She turned slowly, taking in the full scope of what was about to happen. The nature center that would bring noise and activity to her formerly private backyard. The parking lot visible from her windows. The vehicles driving across her property regularly. The $65,000 septic system relocation. The legal fees from the ongoing lawsuit. All of it, every single consequence, stemming directly from her refusal to acknowledge a simple property line issue months ago. I watched as her face transformed through a series of emotions. Anger, disbelief, desperation, and finally devastation. Her hands started shaking as she looked at the papers, then back at the stakes, then at my house. She knew, in that moment, exactly what I had done and exactly how thoroughly she had been outplayed. She had declared war over a 15-foot strip of land and a shed, and I had responded by fundamentally altering the nature of her entire property. Karen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She looked down at the county notice again, as if hoping the words had somehow changed. Then she looked at the property stakes marking where dozens of cars would soon park, where children would soon learn about nature mere feet from her back windows, where her peace and privacy would be permanently shattered. All because she couldn't admit she was wrong about a property line. All because she had to win at any cost. The irony was perfect, the cost was staggering, and the look on her face told me she finally understood that her petty need for control had destroyed the very thing she had been trying to protect. If you made it this far, you know exactly what to do. Smash that like button and subscribe to Karen E World, because we have got dozens more stories, just like this one where entitled people learn very expensive lessons. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in this situation. Would you have been this patient, or would you have gone nuclear sooner? Subscribe so you never miss another epic tale of justice served cold. Trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next on this channel. Now go hit that subscribe button. You know you want to.